Hi, my name is Dr. Shirly Ben-Dor Evian. I'm the curator of Egyptian archaeology at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. I want to welcome you to the museum today for a very special tour that we're giving here on TikTok. And just before we go into the museum, I'd like to show you around. We're here on one of the hills of Jerusalem. Behind me is the parliament, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament building. Around us are other museums and other government buildings, but our museum is really unique in this scene of the governmental district of Jerusalem. One of the reasons that we're so proud of it and it houses such a special collection is right there. That beautiful white dome is the shrine of the book, where the oldest manuscripts of the Bible are held. They date 2,000 years ago, and we know them as the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were found in the Dead Sea, and they are a unique exhibition that draws many, many crowds to our museum. But today, I want to show you other wings in our museum, other parts and places that are just as interesting, and well, you'll be the judge of that. So as we go here, we can also see a little bit the Anish Kapoor statue at the top of the stairs, also one of our highlights in the museum. And as we go down the stairs here, we can see how just in front of us is the youth wing, catering for our younger crowds, with the beautiful yard in front of it. And actually one of the hallmarks of the youth wing is this little statue right here by Hannah Orloff. And you might notice that although it's a bronze statue, the upper part is slightly lighter in its color, and that's because our younger crowd, and even me myself, can't resist sometimes just patting the little head here and maybe giving us a little bit some good luck charm for the rest of the day. So now we can go inside the museum. So you can follow me, and as we go inside, you'll see it's a very big museum. It houses a huge amount of artifacts. So as you can see, it's a very big museum. It houses a huge collection. And if I want to get from here all the way to the end of that corridor, it's going to take me a few good minutes of walking. And today, I'm going to get some help here from Doron, our security guard. How are you? And I'm just going to climb up to this cart and catch a ride. Okay, let's go. So the museum is encyclopedic, which means that we're going to see archaeology as well as ancient art, modern art, pieces of Jewish culture, both from Israel, and the museum also has other Jewish pieces from the diaspora, and it has many wings. Of course, I can't take you to all of these wings today, and we're just going to focus on one, which is the archaeology wing. But I will sort of give you glimpses on the way. For example, we're just heading into the rainbow, this beautiful work by Eliasson on when the rainbow appears. And that's really how we want to end our ascent here into the museum. And thank you, Doron, for this ride. It was great fun. It's going to take us all the way up to the escalator. Woo! Thank you. Okay, so every museum has an escalator, I remind you. Every serious museum, obviously. So we're going up the escalator. Every serious museum has an escalator, of course. And as we're going up and entering into the galleries, you might notice that they're kind of empty. There's not a lot of people. And that's because on Tuesdays is the day that the museum is closed for the public during the morning, and it only opens up in the afternoon. And the curators take this time in the morning to open the display cases and work on the artifacts in the gallery. Of course, we can never open display cases when the crowds are here. So apart from my tour today, which I'll show you what's going on here, I'm also going to have to take a little detour and open one of the cases because I have something I need to be done, and you'll be able to do it with me. And now we're going to enter the archaeology wing. You'll notice that the museum has an art wing right in front of us where the beautiful statue of Nimrod is. And then on the left is the wing for Jewish art and culture. But today, we're going to concentrate on the archaeology wing, and a very unique wing of this museum. And the entrance to the archaeology wing is really phenomenal, with these beautiful human figures standing here behind me. And as we look at them, you might ask yourself, why did we choose to put these here at the entrance to the archaeology wing? Well, the archaeology wing of the Israel Museum showcases the results of excavations that were held in the Holy Land from the early prehistoric periods until the Crusader times. So it gives you the whole history of the country. And these behind me have been excavated in Israel, and they were used as coffins for the dead. They're made of pottery, and the lid, the upper part, can be opened, and the corpse is then inserted inside the coffin, and of course it would be lying down rather than standing up as it is here in the museum, and then covered in the sand. This is why we have this beautiful sand in the display. But if you look closely at the faces of these coffins, you might think that there maybe have something to do with ancient Egypt, because of the wig, the little beard under the chin, the hands that are crossed in that mummy position over the chest. And however, they're not from Egypt. They're from this region here, which at the time they were made was called Canaan. And we choose to put this here because it reminds us that Canaan and later Israel has always been an intersection of cultures. So whatever was going on here was heavily influenced by its neighbors, in this case, the Egyptian Empire. And this is such a good example of how something is an imitation of an Egyptian original that we did here in this land for various reasons. And obviously, when I say imitation, I mean a kind of local adaptation, because, for example, in Egypt, I never saw the like symbol on any of the coffins. So this is truly something unique that's happening right here in Canaan, maybe the most ancient like in world history. So I want to show you the original Egyptian thing, not this Canaanite imitation or influence. And we're going to do that while we're going to another section. And after that, we'll talk a little bit here about this exhibition about ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, but we'll come back to that. So first we're going to go down to the Egyptian gallery and see how the actual Egyptian origin looked like. And as I said, I have some work I need to do there as well. As we go through, show you a glimpse of the beautiful presentation on glass through the ages. Glass was a luxurious item and some of it represented here in the museum is really spectacular from all different times and periods and in cultures and places. And we're going back here. So this is the neighboring cultures gallery. And right here, we can see this section devoted to ancient Egypt. So, if someone of standing and power and influence was buried in ancient Egypt, he would have been buried in a human form, in an anthropoid coffin made of wood, covered with paint, covered with inscriptions in ancient hieroglyphs, beautifully designed, the face, the fake beard, which was only for the dead, okay, and beautiful garland of flowers and flowery items. So just to always have in mind how there is an original and then there is a local interpretation which uses other materials and other means. Okay, and now if you'll excuse me, in the tour, I have to get something done right here in the display. Ooh, thank you, Matan, for opening and for giving me gloves. Thank you. So the display cases are very hard to open. So as you can see, I had some help. And the artifacts themselves are very delicate, and I never touch them with my bare hands, only with gloves. Today, I want to have a look at this little coal tube right here. Okay. It has the name of a king and of a king's daughter. Her name was Iset in ancient Egyptian, which is Isis, the goddess Isis. And the coal tube is very gentle, and it's held here inside this very gentle stand, okay? And you see it's kind of moving here and trembling. And it was used to put coal, which is eyeliner, right, on your eyes. So this would have been some princess's morning routine, to just wake up in the morning, take the coal with a stick out of this coal tube and put it over her eyes and then go out for the rest of her day. So I'm just going to adjust slightly something here in the orientation. And that's it. That was my morning routine for today. So now I can go back to our tour and continue. Thank you, Matan. You're going to close it, right? Okay, bye. Okay. So this morning, I want to talk a little bit about ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, which we just saw on the beautiful coal tube. It said the name of the king, the name of his daughter, and some of their titles, the king's daughter, etc. And ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs are a big mystery, not only to Egyptologists, but of course also to the audience. And I wanted to show the crowds that maybe they're not that mysterious, and maybe they're not so hard to understand. And so I took the hieroglyphs and I put them side by side with our present day emoji, because we are currently more and more writing with pictures, just like the ancient Egyptians wrote with pictures. And as I put them side by side, I noticed that sometimes they look alike. So for example, if I wanted to say in ancient Egyptian script that I was going dancing, this is the symbol that I would use. And it's very similar to this symbol, right, of the dancing man. So if you want to write with pictures that you're going dancing, you're kind of doing the same thing. Even if this is ancient Egypt 5,000 years ago, and this is from Japan, from late 20th century. And other examples that you can see on this wall show how this visual language, despite the vast differences in time and place, have similarities. So for example, if we look at this sign right up there that says, I don't know. So it's literally the hands, okay? It's literally the shoulder and the hands that are shrugging and saying, I don't know. It's very similar to that I don't know, right, emoji that we have in our iPhone. So having looked at this, I started to ask myself, is it just that they look the same, or do we also use it in the same way? And of course, when we use this, we substitute it for the word to dance. So we're using a picture instead of writing a word. And that's exactly what the ancient Egyptians are doing. They were doing the same thing, using a symbol instead of writing a word. So we're actually using it quite the same. So we're going to go now into this exhibition called Emoglyphs, so emoji and hieroglyphs, and see a little bit how hieroglyphs are being used and in what sense there are similarities between these and emojis. So let's go. So, unlike emoji, hieroglyphs were considered to have been created by the gods. They were the words of the gods. This is what Egyptians called them in ancient Egypt. Of course, emoji are the words of Microsoft and Apple and Google, but we're not talking about these gods today. When in Egyptian mythology, the Egyptian gods created the world, they created all things and hieroglyphs. And they were the words of the god, which meant that they had a divine power. It's the word of the god that creates reality, right? Let there be light, there is light. It's just the word of the god. So in ancient Egypt, these signs were not just a script, they were also something sacred that had power. And we can see in this little first example, it's a stela, which means it's an inscription with an image made of wood, which is placed usually in the tomb of a deceased. And we can see the deceased standing like that, with hands raised like that, and he's in front of a god, and he's actually giving praise to a god. And how do I know that he's giving praise to a god? Because as I go down here to the inscription and I look at the second row from the bottom, right on the right side, I see a little figure of a person with their arms raised at the same kind of position. And that is the verb to give praise in ancient Egyptian. So what's happening is that the image is using the hieroglyph. And this is something that's going to be very widespread in Egyptian art. There is a uniformity between what is written and what is depicted. They're all using the same visual language. So let's see another example of that. So this is a relief, a wall relief from a burial. And when you look at it, you might be tempted to think that we kind of have a grocery store here with some bottles and maybe some fruit. There's a nice bone there, still with some flesh on it. And it looks like someone maybe took a picture of this grocery shop. But the fact is that these are offerings for the dead, and they're not just pictures. They're actually the hieroglyphs of the things themselves. So this is the hieroglyph for bread, and this is the hieroglyph for fruit. And these hieroglyphs, instead of being written in a line like we saw before, were enlarged and placed inside a composition so that they look like a picture. But they're not really a picture. They're actually also a picture and an inscription. You can read it. And you might ask yourself, why is this Egyptian art using hieroglyphs? And the reason is because they are sacred. So as we have here the hieroglyph of bread, because it is the word of the god, it would also create the bread for the deceased. So these offerings depicted on the walls, because they are made of hieroglyphs, have the potential of becoming true things for the deceased himself. So this is how hieroglyphs are used inside Egyptian art. But it's not only in two-dimensional art. It's true also of three-dimensional. So for example, if we look here at this beautiful alabaster vessel, and alabaster is this Egyptian marble. It's a little bit transparent, and it's very ancient. It's about 5,000 years old, and it is made in the shape of the hieroglyph for this kind of vessel. So you have the hieroglyph, which is a blueprint for Egyptian art in both two-dimensional and three-dimensional creations. And of course, not everyone had such a beautiful burial with all the offerings that are in relief on the wall of the tomb. And sometimes these offerings, if you didn't have enough money to pay to someone to put all this art in your funeral, in your burial chamber, would be in the shape of little amulets. And the amulets would work just as well as offerings in your tomb because they are not just anything. They are three-dimensional renderings of hieroglyphs. So they're going to work just as well even if you don't have that much money. Let's go to the other side. Now, the use of these hieroglyphs in Egyptian art is way beyond those little reliefs or vessels that we just saw. For example, as we look at this stela, this time it's made of stone, and we see a king here on this side in front of a god. The king is positioned with his hand like this. And this is not coincidental. This is because this position is the hieroglyph to summon. All right? So he is summoning the god in front of him. And the god in front of him is the god Amun, one of the major gods of ancient Egypt at this time. We're somewhere around 1500 BCE, 3,500 years ago. So Amun, the god, is represented here in the same way that he will be represented anywhere when we talk about Amun. And we see that he has these two big feathers on his head. So this is his crown. It's the attribute that tells us that this is the god Amun. He has the short kilt. He has a kind of a stick in his hand, a scepter, and he's standing in this very Egyptian kind of way, right, from the side with one leg in front of the other. And once we recognize this as Amun, we will never mistake it, even when we see it in other formats. So for example, this is a statue of Amun. It's a totally different artifact. It's much later in time. It's around 500 BCE. And yet, it looks exactly like the Amun that we just saw in the stela. And the reason is because of the hieroglyphic model that stands in the base of every representation in ancient Egypt. So once again, we see the high crown with the double feathers. We see how he's standing one leg in front of the other. We see that the hand is stretched, and it once used to have something that, that stick that we saw, the scepter, and it is the short kilt. Everything about it is exactly the same because of the hieroglyphic blueprint. And we look here, we can see the exact same phenomena on little amulets. The Egyptians were masters of small, beautiful artifacts that they wore as amulets, on bracelets, on necklaces. They wore them in life, and they wore them also in death. And most of these amulets were actually a word. They were a hieroglyphic sign. And it's like we do today when we use a word that we either engrave on ourselves as a tattoo or on a piece of jewelry that says the word of a loved one, the name, or just words that give us, charm, good hope, and good fortune. So for example, if we look down here, those little things that look like antennas on the left are actually the hieroglyph for stability. And stability is something that the ancient Egyptians wanted in both life and death. And, I wish I had a little charm like that of stability that I can take with me everywhere and just know that everything is going to be very, very stable. So again, hieroglyphs in all different forms and sizes. And the same goes for the beautiful statues that are so familiar from ancient Egypt. The so-called scribe position of the individual here, which is the hieroglyph for man. This is how we write man, with a hieroglyph that, if you can see here on the label, looks exactly like that. And at the same time, it's also the sculpture of an individual called Imeni, who lived around 4,000 years ago and left this sculpture after his death so that people will remember him and pay the dues that he would need in the afterlife. And if we look on this statue here, once again, something that you leave after you die. And this is a cube-shaped statue. It's actually a person sitting on the ground with the knees bent and a big, long dress covering the entire body. And why would someone represent themselves in this way is because this is the hieroglyph for God. And this person who dies, when he dies, he wants to join the gods. He wants to be immortal like the gods. So he will use this hieroglyph of a god to represent himself. And we have another example of very fine quality, but broken, unfortunately, where we can see the same kind of position, the bent legs, the arms just above the legs holding themselves, and this gaze into eternity of this individual. Up here is another way of showing the Egyptian king. We saw him once summoning the gods. Now we can see him with both arms holding little bowls. He's offering to the gods. So this is the hieroglyph to offer. So again, the king is depicted like a hieroglyph for the verb to offer. he's offering something to this god in the shape of a jackal. This is the god Anubis. He's the protector of the dead, of the cemeteries where the people were buried. And every part of this composition is actually hieroglyphs. This is why I can find parallels and similarities between that relief and other little things that we see here. For example, this statuette of a person, again, offering to the gods. You can see the position of the foot is very similar to the position of the foot in the relief that we just saw. So it's the same position exactly. And here's Anubis, okay, that we just saw. Again, it'll always look the same because it's all part of this hieroglyph. So now we'll go over to the other side. So hieroglyphs are very powerful in Egyptian art, but they are most powerful when we're talking about life after death. You know, the Egyptians believed that dying here in this life did not mean the end of life. It meant that there is a passage to eternity. And in order to reach that eternity, that paradise where they would live forever, they had to go through a process in the underworld where it would be decided if they could actually go to eternity and live there like the gods, or maybe they were not worthy of it. So hieroglyphs were used for spells and for powerful magic that needed to happen in this passage through the underworld and the transformation from a human being to an immortal. So for example, Egyptians, after having mummified the body, would place on the body certain objects like this breastplate, which was placed here on the collar, the upper chest. And it's a beautiful ornament. It's made of cartonnage, which are layers of linen and papyrus that have been mashed together and then gilded with gold. And there's no inscription. If we look at it, the only thing we see is the beetle scarab. And the beetle scarab is a very curious thing to put on someone's chest when he's dying and waiting for the afterlife. And the reason is that the Egyptians considered the scarab, the beetle, to be something of a magical being, because they would see it with, it's a dung beetle, right? So they would see it in the field, creating this big ball of dung, and then they would come the next day, and out of this ball of dung would come out new little beetles. And of course, they didn't see the entire process of how they were conceived. So for them, this was an actual miracle. It was rebirth, something that is completely dead, dung in the field, that comes to life. And this is something that they wanted for themselves as they moved into this transition from life, rebirth, and eternity. And they considered the beetle to have this beautiful power of regenerating, of creating life where there was no life before. And they associated this with another powerful image that was in Egypt, that was the rising sun. Again, the sun was this magical being that goes up in the sky, brings life and light to everything, but then at the end of every day it dies. It goes somewhere, we don't know where, it dies, but then in the morning it comes back to life and it brings new life, just like the beetle. So they consider the dung beetle to be a representation of the god of the rising sun. And they put it in their grave because they wanted the same thing to happen to them, to be rebirth after death. And then this scarab beetle was also the hieroglyph for the verb to become alive, to become regenerated. So it actually is an inscription. And that's the beauty of having a writing system that is based on pictures, because there's just one little image and it carries with it so much weight, also as a hieroglyph and also as a mythology that helps you in the afterlife. And of course, all this, the mummy and these beautiful breastplates, were placed in beautiful coffins. And we've seen another example of this before. This is a coffin lid that was placed on top of the mummy and closed. And it's beautifully decorated in all kinds of colors. We have blues and greens and reds and white and some yellow, and all these beautiful colors are creating a very complicated scene on the coffin. And the different scenes that are on this coffin are designed to help the deceased in his journey in the underworld. In this case, it's her journey, because this coffin lid belongs to a woman that was called Jedmut. I know this because it's written on the coffin in ancient hieroglyphs. And Jedmut, according to the inscriptions, was a chantress, a singer in the temple of Amun in Egypt. So she belonged to a family of priests, and this is why she got this beautiful coffin, and she had a beautiful burial, as was the custom for anyone in her position. And Jedmut would have had many things with her in the grave to help her in that journey. Some of the scenes would have spells that would tell her how to behave in certain parts of the journey. For example, if there would be a gatekeeper and she would have to go through that gate, she would have to know the name of the gatekeeper. So that's part of the information that she is being given in her coffin. All this information comes from a book called the Book of the Dead. That book is like the Lonely Planet for the afterlife. It gives you a complete guide how to go through all the phases, what to say, where, how to behave, etc. And Jedmut would have all these things with her. And hopefully, if Jedmut succeeded in her journey, she would end up in the Egyptian version of paradise. And the Egyptian version of paradise is these beautiful fields, just like the beautiful fields on the Nile, with perfect weather and a very pastoral kind of lifestyle. However, since it was an imitation of the good life on the Nile, it also had a problem. You see, in ancient Egypt, everyone had to do some work that was for the public work. So every person would have to, once a year, go and register for this work, do some digging, maybe of water channels, maybe prepare some bricks that are made of mud, all these kind of works. The elite, like Jedmut and her family, were exempt from this work because, they were doing important things like everywhere in the world. If you have the, high position, you don't do these things. But Jedmut and her friends were worried that in the afterlife, this exemption is not going to hold, and they would have to do manual labors. And so they included in their graves these little servant figurines. And servant figurines of all shapes and sizes would have an inscription on them, as we see right here. And these inscriptions would say, okay, I am the servant figurine of XYZ, and if XYZ is called to work, then I will stand up and work instead of him or her. So as you go into an Egyptian grave, you might find sometimes even hundreds of these servant figurines, one for each day of the year, a few supervisors, and a few extras that can work while others are getting some time off. So that was the Egyptian kind of way to get to the afterlife. Let's move to the other side. So we've seen so many hieroglyphs. Let's see if we can read something really hieroglyphic writing. We have this beautiful relief here with 2 columns of hieroglyphs. And the first thing that people always ask me is, how do we read it? From right to left, from left to right, from top to bottom, from bottom to the top? And the answer is that there are more than one ways. And whoever is preparing the relief tells you how to read it. So the first thing we need to look at are the animals. Where are these animals facing? So if we look at the owl, look at the beautiful details on this owl, or this snake here, or the lion up there, you'll notice that they're all facing a single direction. They're all looking that way, which means that whatever I'll be reading here, I'll be reading from there. They're all looking at the beginning of the line. So we're all looking from there to here. So in this case, from left to right. But they're also in columns. So in columns, I always start from the top. So I look from the top, but from this column, because obviously we just said that we're reading from left to right. So this column first, from the top, and then if I have 2 signs, one next to each other in the column, I'll start from the left to the right, and then down, down, left, right, down, down, and so on. So this is one of the reasons that, you study Egyptology and ancient Egyptian for many, many years, so you can figure these out. And this is a section from a larger inscription. So obviously, as we translate it, we're translating half sentences in this place, and there's nothing we can do. This is how we find the items sometimes in their broken state. So let's look here. This is the left column of the inscription, and we can see this, the eye, and then the owl, and another sign here. And this together, something that will not be done, we're talking about, like I said, this is part. So the phrase started somewhere in the broken section, and then something will not be done following his heart. So you can have a look at the heart hieroglyph, okay? It's not like the heart that we draw today that actually has nothing to do with the heart. The Egyptians knew what the heart looked like, a vessel with 2 big extensions, just as the actual heart is. So something will not be done following his heart. This is the end of the first sentence, and then we have a new sentence. The overseer of the priests of Soped. Soped is an Egyptian god of the east, of the eastern deserts. And so this monument belongs to someone who was the overseer of the priests of Soped. So he was a high priest, important person. And you can have a look here how the word priests is written in ancient Egyptian. So this flag here is a sign for the god. And this is the sign for servant. So a servant of the god is a priest. And then because we want to talk about priests, we have 3 lines. And 3 lines tell us that we have to multiply. So 3 is a lot, as opposed to 1, singular and plural. So the overseer of the priests of Soped, Soped in the eastern Nile Delta. So this is just a small example of hieroglyphs and how they work. Sometimes a heart is a heart and we can read it, and sometimes we need to extrapolate a little bit more in order to understand the actual inscription. So this is all we have time for right now. And I'm going to have to say goodbye for now. Thank you so much for joining me on this beautiful tour in the Israel Museum. And I hope to see you here in the museum, in the galleries. And if not, you can just follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. We're there for you.